Good afternoon and welcome to today's sponsored content webinar with 5-Star Fans. I'm Kara Dietzel, Vice President at NACDA, and we're glad to have you with us for this very important topic with a distinguished group of panelists, which Tina will have the pleasure of introducing in a moment. Moderating today's session is Tina Provost, Chief Executive Officer at 5-Star Fans. Tina is a former Division I athlete from The Ohio State University and has been engaged with college athletics for the past 20 years as a fundraiser and board member. 5-Star Fans will also be hosting a roundtable as part of the NACDA NIL Educational Seminar taking place on Sunday, June 9th and Monday, June 10th as part of the 2024 NACDA and Affiliates Convention in Las Vegas. So if you haven't registered for that track yet, please visit the NACDA website or contact a NACDA staff member. Before we begin, a quick reminder for our live attendees to utilize the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. To submit any questions throughout the discussion. We will have time allotted at the end to answer those. And an email will be sent out later today to all registered attendees with a link to today's recording. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Tina.
Thank you, Kara. Hi, everybody. It's good to see you. Thank you to our 5 panelists that are joining us today. This is a pretty juicy topic, so we have a lot of stuff to cover. So we're excited to hear questions, too, from the group as you put those through the chat. So what I'll do is I'm going to make an introduction to each of our 5 panelists briefly. And then we'll go over the topic, which is adapting to change, the evolution of economics in college athletics. We're going to touch on a few high-level topics, and then we'll dive deeper as we tap on some of the panelists to answer specifically from the industry that they're in. The 3 main topics we'll talk through are harnessing the power of name, image, and likeness, NIL, our favorite topic, reimagining the fan experience in a digital age, and then the economics of the transfer portal and conference realignment we'll get to here throughout the day. So, or the hour, not the whole day. You're only with us for an hour. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. The first panelist we have is Ayden Syal. He is the co-founder and CEO of MOGL. MOGL is the leading athlete influencer marketplace that services over 15,000 athletes across the United States and more than 2,000 businesses and brands. Next up, we have Cody Wilcoxson, a sports and NIL litigation attorney from Blank Rome. He is one of the most highly respected legal minds in the NIL industry right now throughout college athletics. And Blank Rome represents the top and most notable high net worth clients in the industry, athletes, coaches, agents, and C-suite executives. Darien Harris is also a former student athlete from Michigan State, where he's serving today. He serves as the primary NIL contact for both internal and external stakeholders, partners, collectives, athletes, agents, everybody that touches the system there. Jason Belzer is here from Student Athlete NIL. He is the founder and co-chairman, and Student Athlete NIL services over 50 NIL collectives, and he's really building a brand that teaches and engages the collectives to service their institutions in a much more thoughtful and productive way. And then we have Laine Higgins from the Wall Street Journal. She is a sports reporter that primarily covers college sports in New York, and the coverage centers mostly around the NCAA. So we're excited to have her too. Thank you for the 5 of you for participating today. I know you have a lot of different thoughts and perspectives because we're all in different segments of college athletics. So this is going to be a good discussion. You guys ready? Okay. So the first question is around reimagining the fan experience in the digital age. And we'll spend about 10 minutes here. And so in an era of this rapid technological advancement, we're shifting consumer behaviors, fan experience is undergoing a huge transformation. What we're going to ask and talk about what's being done to leverage technology and innovation to enhance the fan experience and fan engagement, and what are the implications from a revenue generation perspective and sustainability. And so we're going to tap on Darien first. Do you have any initial thoughts or what perspective on that first topic here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely one of the major talking points across the country, across the world, in all different sectors of life, is where technology is going. When you think about obviously AI and what's going on in that sector, and virtual reality and all those things, and it of course has infiltrated athletics in a positive way a lot of on the pro space. And I think that it is with a lot of things in sports, you learn from each other. So at the collegiate space, in terms of fan experience, especially in venue, we're learning a lot from the pro space and trying to adapt and change with the times to keep up. One of the ways that we look at it here at Michigan State is you have two different demographics, right? You have the longtime fans, the season ticket holders, maybe an older demographic in age. They're coming to the games no matter what, right? They've had tickets in their families for 30 years. They've sat in the same seats. So how do we make their experience better? But one of the ways we leverage technology to do that is entrance into the stadium. So we implemented metal detectors in all of our sporting events and venues this past year, and made for a lot more seamless entry into arenas. Again, you don't have to take everything out of your pockets. It doesn't slow down that process. It was really beneficial for our longtime patrons who are just looking at ways to have a better experience in terms of going to our sporting events. You think of POS systems when it comes to concessions, making those more streamlined and easier to check out because everybody goes to the concession stand at the same time, right? Halftime, end of quarter, things of that nature. How do you make that a faster situation for them? And then something that does include technology that I think a lot of people don't think about, and it's kind of funny, but it's a serious aspect, is just adding more bathrooms and enhanced bathrooms in terms
I
of
love that. Yes.
right? The more stalls you have, the more bathrooms you have. Again, it makes people's experience a lot better in venue. So we looked at it from that angle. The other side of it, right, is the student experience. You're creating your consumers for the future, right? And so, of course, as students, you're at a place like Michigan State or Ohio State or anywhere that really any college, you want the students to have a great experience because you want them to enjoy their time in school. It's a finite amount of time, but you also want them in the future to be your season ticket holders and to come back. So we've implemented a student fan rewards program. We have 16,000 students that have actually signed up for that. And through that, you create competition with each other as students, right? You also are able to link it to other corporate opportunities. So, for example, our Detroit Tigers fan night had the highest selling point in terms of tickets because we also tossed it into the student rewards package. So being signed up for the student rewards package meant you also got access to the Detroit Tigers tickets when we had our Michigan State night, which of course makes the Tigers happy. So being able to do things like that, make for a better experience for the students. We implemented a new scoreboard, video board in the Breslin Center for basketball this year. We've implemented new scoreboards around in our other venues. And the future, of course, is bringing in what some professional sporting arenas are doing. So if you look at the Baltimore Ravens, you saw with the Carolina Panthers implementing augmented reality. The Dallas Cowboys have implemented virtual reality where you can take a picture with current players on the team through VR. So I think that's the next iteration of what's coming next from a technological standpoint in college venues.
That's awesome. And it sounds like what I love a lot about it is what I'm hearing is the efficiency of the experience physically. It's such a big deal. And I mean, while we're all industry leaders and we played sports, we're also fans too. And that's important. We want to be watching the game. We want to be in the arena more and not waiting in line for a bathroom or whatever it is. So that's awesome. Anything, Darien, on the digital side? So, a stadium, for instance, when they're on campus, holds less than 2% of the entire fan base, 100,000 fans in Ohio Stadium, yet we have 12 million of us across the world. So have you guys talked or done anything, explored around the digital way to engage fans that way?
Yeah, absolutely. We have our Spartan Sports Network that, of course, houses radio, but also houses direct links to watching from a visual standpoint. All of our collegiate sports and athletic events, because like you said, you want to make sure that you're worldwide. We have 600,000 living alums from Michigan State and obviously millions of fans. So you want to make sure that the touch points in terms of how you can reach people span across the world, no matter what. So how are we able, as you mentioned, in the digital age, to get what we have in venue out to the people? I mean, look, you see what happened with the WNBA, right? The Chicago Sky game was shown by a fan, right? A fan showed the game online. There was 400,000 people watching. So if there's an appetite for people to see it, you got to show it, right? And so streaming through different opportunities like that. BTN has Big Ten Network implemented BTN Plus, of course, over the past couple years. Different ways to allow for the masses to visually see the games and the things going on, not just from a football and men's basketball perspective, but all of our sports. we want to have that visual component and the ability to follow along with the games.
Yeah, awesome. I love that. Jason, I want to ask you about this just because of the breadth you have across all the collectives that are under your umbrella. Do you see anything being incorporated in your collectives at each of those institutions or just in their day-to-day business to deepen the engagement with the fans digitally?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, Tina. At the end of the day, we look at ourselves as a fan engagement company first and foremost. And while we are leveraging student athletes for that, we are also looking at it and saying the collective is essentially what is the entrepreneurial arm of college athletics. And so I think the best analogy that I will use is that one of the reasons why so many minor league baseball teams have done really well, or at least the ones that have done well, is that they've gone out and they've created really fun fan engagement opportunities. And you think about what a minor league baseball team does when they decide to become the tacos or some other crazy idea or name where they go build a brand around that. Well, that's sort of what the collective is, right? For the last 100 years, you were a Oklahoma fan or a, whatever, but now you can also be a Crimson and Cream fan and you can go and create different engagement. So we have already started that, and we have seen, as an example, at our universities, leveraging unencumbered assets that the university really never thought about to be able to go out and figure out really cool ways. So whether it's golf outings or fishing trips, and then also engaging through a digital context. And so the most successful company in the world when it comes to college athletics revenue generation is Fanatics. People don't realize that, but it's close to a $40 billion company. They're selling literally billions of dollars in merchandise, and they've kind of figured out how this all works. And so what we're looking at is doing the same and saying, you have maybe 50,000, 100,000 people that come to your football game once a week for 6 times a year, but you have an alumni base of 1 million people. How many of those are actually engaging with your athletics department consistently? And the answer is it's very few. And so what's that engagement look like for the rest of the year outside of when somebody's actually watching your game? And we believe at least that the collective and the leverage of the student athletes as the ambassadors is what's going to allow universities to be able to generate more revenue than they are today and make the pie bigger for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And we talk about sometimes, Fanatics sells merchandise and we talk about that experience, and it's a transactional experience though. If I want to buy a hat, I get the hat and that's it. But you're talking more about bringing people together more as a community versus just a transactional, I can wear my swag or I get my dog's bandana, a little dog bandana with the logo on it. So that's cool. I love to hear that. Thank you. And then just a lot from media, news, and reporting, Laine, I was going to tap on you to see if you've seen a change in the way fans are absorbing your content, the things you write about, how people want to interact with the journal or any other media outlet.
Yes and no. One area, it's less directly with me, but one way I've seen coaches and media be able to engage with fans in a much more seemingly constructive way is through Twitter Spaces, or X Spaces, if that still exists. I think it really kind of came to a rise right around the TCU Georgia title game at the end of that season. And there was a lot of fun opportunities for coaches to talk directly to fans in a way that you usually don't get that kind of access. I will say changes to that platform have made it kind of more siloed. So I sort of don't know, with anyone on X now, like how good the reach is compared to what it once was, perhaps. So I think the ways that people are getting their content is a little bit different. Players can reach fans in a lot more of a direct way through their social media and through TikTok and things like that, and especially with younger fans. So I think the ways that people are consuming sports, it's increasingly the highlights and the small stuff. And our readership is very much skewed not that direction. I think the average age of the journal reader is like in their late 50s. So I mostly get emails that are sent from my iPad, but those are strong as ever.
Yeah. Oh, good. Okay. And Ayden, I guess that just made me think about brands. Are they engaging differently, technology from the fan perspective? Are they relying mostly on the student athlete to be the one that's engaging with the fans and then ultimately is promoting the brand?
Yeah, ultimately, at the end of the day, from a brand perspective, they're looking to leverage student athletes' audience and reach in order to reach the end consumer, which is the fans or potentially the undergraduate students at the school, right? It's a really direct avenue for brands to directly target Gen Z consumers, for example. So at least on our platform and really broadly throughout the influencer space within NIL, that's the broad benefit of brands engaging with student athletes is at mass scale, you can run influencer marketing campaigns, specifically target geographic growth areas for you, age demographics, audience demographics at a scale that doesn't really exist throughout the broader influencer space because of how targeted it is to directly to Gen Z consumers. But one of the other things that we've seen as well, just broadly with the NIL space, is that at its core, NIL has really democratized access to student athletes in general, whether it be for brands, whether it be for fans, consumers, donors, everything else, right? And there's two ways that we're really observing this and kind of trying to help further democratize that access. So on our platform, fans can come in, request video shout outs, appearances, autograph signings directly through the platform, similar to like a Cameo type model. But then something that I'm sure Jason knows extremely well is some of the collectives that we've worked with have really, really expanded their digital offering for fans that are donating to the collectives. So whether it be app-based experiences, podcasts, exclusive events, all distributed digitally, going back to what Darien was saying, like how do we reach the millions of fans throughout the world, not just the 100,000 in the seats? And that's been really, really cool to see because it's coupled with NIL monetization. So in exchange for appearing on a podcast or doing an exclusive event, athletes are being able to be compensated and the fans are getting a really exclusive experience that they wouldn't otherwise have.
Yeah. I like that what you're saying there too, because sometimes when people imagine NIL, we only hear about these really big, wild deals that are going on. And you're seeing everything else, the other 98%. There's so much more in all these collaborations. So it's interesting to hear about. And I feel like that could be its own topic on its own. But thank you. And Kara, I'm sorry, are we doing Q&A after each topic, or are we waiting until the very end?
That's your call, however you want to manage that.
Okay. We'll do it at the very end because we may talk about something and it answers the question. And so we'll gather them if we have time at the end, if that's all right. Okay, so we'll move on to the next topic. And so the introduction of NIL opportunities has been a major game changer in college sports. And so now, like what Ayden was saying, student athletes get to monetize their personal brands. This isn't just large schools. I mean, anybody in college athletics can leverage their own brand and monetize that, which is a good thing. And it's not even just getting brand deals. It's like they can get jobs now and host a camp or something like that. But even for the non-revenue generating athletes at smaller institutions, this is a big deal. And so universities, how are universities, the athletes, the brands navigating the new terrain? And what are the implications for those non-rev gen athletes in the sports in athletics? I was one of them. We're going to tap on Ayden first, which you sort of have talked about it. So we'll dive a little deeper into that. How they're navigating the new terrain. How do they feel about it? What have you been experiencing in just, 2.5, 3 short years?
Yeah. So I'd say that we've certainly come a long way. Within the first year of NIL, there was certainly some hesitation on an institutional level on how we want to support our student athletes and to what extent we want to go about supporting student athletes. But now, fast forward, nearly 4 years into this experience, we're now seeing broad-based adoption and really broad-based support across all NCAA divisions for the student athletes. So what we're seeing is specific across Division II and Division III as well is schools are really adopting software solutions in order to really connect their networks of fans, local businesses, corporate sponsors to their athletes in order to really support them and continue to democratize that access. The other thing that we're really seeing is that from an influencer marketing perspective, brands are extremely excited about essentially aggregating the long tail of college athlete influencers. So it's not just football, men's basketball, but they're really, really excited about the opportunity to work with hundreds, if not thousands, of women's soccer players, men's track and field players. Actually, in 2024 alone, marketplace transactions, so overall payments on the MOGL platform, only 7% is football. Men's track and field and women's track and field are actually leading the way. And then total deliverables completed on the platform in 2023, men's and women's soccer were the highest. So I think that that really excites us because it ultimately shows that, yeah, maybe an individual men's track and field athlete at Oregon State doesn't have the same notoriety, reach, and publicity as the quarterback at Oregon State. But when you aggregate, the entire men's track and field team or individual men's track and field athletes across the country, there's much broader reach and ultimately a much higher ROI being delivered to these brands. So that's what's really exciting to us. And we've seen a growing trend towards wanting to work with non-revenue sport athletes.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. I never would have guessed track and field would be above all the others. And when we were first navigating the space and talking with athletes, we talked with a swimmer, for instance, and she's like, I don't think NIL's for me because I'm just one person. I have 500 followers. But this is encouraging for her if we were to say, well, actually, if you bring together a group of your team or even the cheer and dance teams collaborating that way, I mean, such a huge reach. Like what you're saying, you can get now 30 people promoting the brand and reaching all their different audiences versus just the one. So I love hearing that. And so staying on this topic of groups, teams, universities, Cody, you see a lot. You're all over the country. You get to see, and you might be unbiased because you're not specifically affiliated with any one particular university. Do you feel like any institution or group is doing it the best or very well?
I think there are a lot of schools out there that are doing it very well and anticipating and preparing. We're sort of on this precipice. I'm sure everyone that is listening to this panel has been engaged in reading in everything that's going on with college sports over the last couple of weeks and the litigation and the antitrust lawsuits and how that might be resolved, right? We're all reading the same reports and the articles of what this looks like in the coming months. And you've seen a lot of schools and states really start to take action. I mean, just in the last 2 weeks, Oklahoma introduced a bill that Oklahoma and Oklahoma State were advocating for that basically said, if and when we get to pay players, we get to play players immediately. So their law says if the federal government or the conference allows it, we get to do it instantaneously. And they're getting all of that ready. And I think a lot of schools are starting to prepare for whether it's a revenue share or just being able to directly compensate their athletes for opportunities that I think are really positive. And I think from a brand side, something that I think is really interesting and obviously this is the biggest example of it is for a revenue sport, but I think you'll start to see things like this in non-revenue sports as well as, they just announced the college basketball tournament. I think they're calling it the Players Era Festival that's going to be in Las Vegas next year during Thanksgiving weekend. And each of the teams is going to get about $1 million investment in NIL for their student athletes for participating. And then the winning team of the tournament will get an additional $1 million in NIL investment that's going to be distributed through collectives. And the athletes are going to have requirements and responsibilities during that week where they'll do NIL activations in the local community in Las Vegas. But an athlete is going to choose to go to one of those schools because, hey, I'm going to get, 1/15 of $1 million just that week for playing basketball, in addition to whatever compensation I can get. So I think there's a lot of brands and that money is actually private equity money that's going to start pouring into college athletics. So you're seeing this huge kind of financial opportunity as some of the guidelines and restrictions that have been in place start to fall away or adapt to more of the modern society. There are schools that are really thinking, how can we help our athletes maximize, or what opportunities can we create, like participating in this college basketball tournament? They're going to immediately generate NIL opportunities for our student athletes.
Yeah. So without naming specific schools or institutions, am I hearing you correctly in that the ones that are preparing right now for any litigate or any regulations to come about and are using those tournaments and helping the students, they're the ones that are going to win, or those are the ones that are doing it well, because that also supports the recruiting efforts too. If they're showcasing, look what we're doing for our student athletes, that's going to entice a player to want to be part of that school.
Yeah, I think it's twofold, right? It's preparing for if they're able to compensate or directly assist in the compensation, preparing for that side of it, but also in addition to that, finding opportunities and assisting their student athletes with generating opportunities, and certainly at minimum not getting in the way of opportunities that are out there and available to student athletes.
Yeah, at a minimum. Yeah, that's like the bare minimum there. Jason, I'm curious then, as we're talking about who's doing it well, you have over 50 collectives that are in part of student athlete NIL. Are there any examples of institutions or a collective group that is doing something really, really good and they've figured out a nice way to support the students? And you don't have to name names if you don't want to play favorites, but any examples of good things going on in the space that are doing it well?
Yeah, so I think first of all, it's good to provide a more holistic overview of what's happening in NIL right now. If you look at NIL dollars, let's say during the 2024 calendar year, the industry is probably at around the $700 million total aggregate amount of money that will go to student athletes. Of that, 85% at minimum is what is not true NIL, but is really roster value. So the average P4 collective this year will be around $4.5 million for football and about 1.8 million for basketball. And then if you look at it on the high level, so we'll say SEC conference, the average SEC football collective will be about $10 million and basketball will be closer to $2.5 million. The average value of any student athlete, just go pick a student athlete at random in the Division I level from a true NIL standpoint, they're not worth more than four figures. And that's just a reality. You look at social media following, you look at potential from an actual NIL standpoint. So we have to sort of say what's real NIL versus what's not real NIL. Now, the student athletes that are getting compensated millions of dollars literally just signed the contract yesterday for a football transfer for $900,000. If we were going to go try to sell him from a brand standpoint, maybe he's worth 50 to 100,000, right? So it's really pay for play by another name. But the reality is that athlete is generating revenue for the university, and the university is deriving revenue from that athlete, no different than an NFL or an NBA player creates money for their teams and leagues. So what's going to matter moving forward around NIL is how the universities work with collectives and other entities to really be able to leverage and augment what they're doing, and not just say, hey, this athlete is worth X and we're going to, because the true NIL market right now is quite small. So some schools that are doing it, so, Cody talks about the Players Era event. We have 4 of our teams participating in that. And so that is an opportunity. Those teams are going to earn $1 million a year, every year for the next 3 years for participating in that event. It is private equity backed, but they will make money through their television rights or streaming rights, because it's likely that event will be on Amazon or YouTube or Netflix. They are going to make money through partnerships and other things. So they've seen an arbitrage opportunity to come in, be first to create a really high level event that will be 16 teams next year, and say, well, we know the athletes are worth X, so $1 million to the team is a completely reasonable investment. They'll probably make 2X on that.
Got it.
That's where we see things. Some universities are very progressive, right? So we work with the University of Oklahoma. They're extremely progressive. They're smart. And that's why they have been able to punch above their weight, because they're about to enter the SEC. They have a pretty big fan base, but when you look at the average income of their alumni as compared to other institutions, it's much less. And so we have produced more than $1 million for them in commercialized NIL. That's a lot. Like, that is a lot for the average institution, because again, most of these athletes are not making a whole lot themselves. And the key to that, and the system that we've built, which is going to be everywhere anyway, is when we have athletes signed to a contract. So at Oklahoma, every football player is signed to a contract. They have a certain number of deliverables that they have to do for us. So as an example, Oklahoma student athletes contracts with us include group licensing. So if I want to go sell a football trading card with an Oklahoma student athlete on it, Kenneth, who's on this card, didn't receive additional compensation for this opportunity. He was already paid by the collective for his rights. And that money that was generated through that program, which was probably about $250,000, went back into the collective for the following year. And so when we move into a revenue share model, schools will be doing what we're doing now, which is purchasing the rights of the athletes and then trying to monetize those rights so that they can go recoup and then continue to increase their payrolls moving forward. That is what the NIL of the future looks like, is trying to capture as much of those opportunities as possible.
Yeah. And it sounds like Oklahoma's I was going to ask why you think they're so progressive, but you gave the example of how they're engaging with the student athlete with the rights and the marks. And the athletes seem in favor of that. You know, you handle all this. I have these deliverables. It sounds like it keeps it easier for the student athletes so they can actually focus on.
Isn't that how the professional sports model works? And then imagine if you went to an NFL player and said, like, we're going to pay you this, but you got to go figure out all this stuff yourself. They would never have to do it, right? That's not how it. You need a very simplified, efficient model in order to make this thing work. The schools that are not doing that are very inefficient. And, you know, everybody's like, well, we have to go raise money through donors. Donors is not a sustainable model. It's just not, right? Like, if you don't get a return on investment, I mentioned earlier, the average SEC football collectives here will be $10 million. There's going to be 16 teams in the league. The team that finishes 16th, those donors are not showing up again to say, we're going to keep funding this if you're not going to create a return on investment. So unless you actually are creating real ROI for the people that are engaging in your NIL program, you don't have a shot. And if you're already in the hole, good luck trying to get out of it by that point.
Right. And when the IRS removed the benefit of the tax deduction and going through the collectives, you know, that probably made that even less
hurting a lot of, and all of our collectives, all 50 plus of them, are all commercialized entities. We knew that that's where the ball was going, and that's what the sustainable model has to become.
Yeah. And just, I guess now bringing up that topic about the IRS thing here, there are a lot of other things, changes weekly, daily. We have some that we're anticipating coming up. And I want to just open it up to everybody. How do you guys keep track of it all? Do you, or do you have someone that just shares the information on a regular basis or as a need to know? How do you guys keep up with that? Cody, that's kind of your job, but.
Yeah, I subscribe to a number of newsletters that I get in my inbox every morning. I have Google alerts. I try and, track as many people in the industry and social media that they're pushing out. And just, I spend probably 25 minutes every morning just trying to take in everything that sort of happened in the last day or two. So I, and as things pique my interest, as I see something in a newsletter, I got to make sure I click on that article. I got to know what's happening, with, one thing that this is a good example. I came across my news feed this morning. Tennessee's Collective, the Volunteer Club, announced an app yesterday. And it's one that I know a number of collectives are working on things similar to it, but it is a fan engagement app. It's using technology to help drive value for their donor base because of, donor fatigue. And exactly what Jason just talked about is people aren't just going to give you $100 a month just because, and you hope your football team is really good and growing. They want digital content, they want access, they want these things. And so you see this, every day there's something being announced. There's, a school lobbying for a law change in their state. There's a new bill introduced in Congress that's, going to get batted around and not passed probably, but you see this every day. But NIL is just you have so many constituents, you have so many players in this area. There's so much going on. It's impossible to know everything. But there's, following if certain newsletters, Google alerts, things like that to kind of track what's going on, I think is important to, keep your finger on the pulse.
Yeah. Laine, you write about this stuff. How do you keep up with and what the relevant articles and topics to discuss?
Yeah, I like to joke. I have a colleague who has covered a lot of the legal stuff inside of this with me, and we have a spreadsheet that's just tracking all of the legal cases and NLRB cases that are currently facing the NCAA. And you have your alerts on that whenever there's like a new amicus brief filed or whatever. And it's a lot of legalese to wade through at times, but for the most part, it's what Cody was saying. You're constantly scanning publications and Twitter and various news sources, and the real thing is having conversations. And I think if you can get, as at least in my industry, as close to the people that are in the room having the conversation, so the university presidents, the ADs, the general counsels, things like that, and always asking the question, what should be on my radar, who am I not talking to, and trying to just have as many conversations as possible. I mean, I think it's a successful day when you talk to a couple people on the phone, and if you're not talking to anyone, maybe you're still learning things, but it's always better to just have more conversations, because to be quite frank, it is overwhelming. Especially covering it from a national perspective when it's not just one school, it's impossible to stay on top of everything. But trying to have regular outreach with the people that work on different sides of this, both in compliance and in collectives and athletes and parents, like it can be tough to keep track of all of that. And I get paid to do this, and I feel like I'm still in over my head a lot of the time just because there's so much happening. But yeah, you're never going to be able to keep up with all of it because every day there's something new. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point, though. There are some people that are more progressive, forward thinking, like Jason, for instance. Some of the examples you were talking about, like you were forward thinking and ahead of the ball compared to most. But if anybody claims to be an expert in NIL right now, I would challenge that's probably not true. We're all learning this and changing together. So you're not alone, Laine. It seems like we're all trying to figure it out. And then Darien, you're in an institution internally. What's your day like keeping up with all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, we have a weekly touch base, which is extremely helpful for us internally. It's for an hour, probably should be for 5 hours, honestly, because once we get to the end of the 60 minutes, there's still a lot outstanding, but you bring in everybody that kind of touches NIL. And it's been interesting because in the past few years when it started, as you mentioned, nobody really knew how many people needed to touch this. So we had a committee of 15. And then in the past year, we broke it down to 3. But it's seeming that more and more people are starting to enter back into the room. So I wouldn't be surprised if we get back up to 15 again amongst our department, because you realize that everybody has a touch place and touch point with NIL, from our compliance department to the legal, to the MMR rights, to marketing, to licensing, to, of course, the student athlete development, touching the student athletes from their perspective and their vantage point. Everybody has a piece of NIL. And so it's not enough to just have 1 or 2 people that are discussing it on a daily or weekly basis. You have to have everybody that's a part of the university. And it's even branched into university advancement, and it goes up to the president level. Like, everybody has to understand and has to know what's going on from an NIL standpoint. OGC, everybody's involved.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, as much as maybe some people want to resist it, everyone has to be part of it to make it successful. And we could probably do another webinar just on this topic. I feel like all the topics could be their own day of a webinar meeting, but thank you guys. We're going to move on to the next one. We're talking about the economics of the transfer portal, conference realignment. Jason touched on a little bit earlier too. And so the transfer portal, all these realignments have become pretty significant in shaping how the economy looks like for college athletics. And so I'm going to first tap on Laine. What's the consequence of college football's transfer craze, and how do you feel like the recruiting strategies are being impacted, donor fatigue? What are you hearing, since you're kind of at the center of all the communication? What do you think about that?
I mean, I think it's sort of twin prongs in that there is a lot of support for athlete freedom and athletes being able to, have more ownership of their college career. But at the same time, there is so much chaos around it. I mean, it's like in the NFL, there's not free agency for every player every season because that would be nuts. And you also don't do it in the middle of the playing season, whereas that's what college is. And I think there's a feeling amongst a lot of the administrators and coaches that that's not a very efficient or sustainable model, in that, yes, we want to have some way for players to transfer more freely, but there's got to be a better medium, because the sort of the guardrails lifted on this at a time when there was so many other changes happening. Like, I think if the transfer portal had come around at a time when NIL was not also about to be new, it might be a little bit different. But now that there's a financial component that can come into these players moving, it created these sort of unintended consequences of what happens. And, it's true. There's a lot of teams that have changed their strategy from, really basing it on development and high schoolers and moving more towards transfers because you get the more experience. And, look no further than the men's NCAA basketball tournament. Most of the teams that are winning are older, and you're not seeing so many one and done players. And Coach Calipari is not at Kentucky. Like, these things sort of have these knock-on effects where you have a lot of different changes in the industry. And it's not to say the pendulum can't swing back if the rules change, but I think right now, roster construction is very different. And also just there's a narrowing of timeline of expectations for how long a coach gets to turn around a program. And I think, for better or worse, like, you are given such little wiggle room these days, and you're expected to succeed year one, year two, and it's really just heightened up the expectations for everyone involved. And I think some of this might ease once some of the COVID bonus years start finally phasing out. We're getting to that point where almost everyone that was given an option to have an extra year is now graduated or on from college. We're not quite there, but soon. And, that will sort of shorten careers a little bit. It might make things younger again. It might change recruiting. But right now, I think there's a great feeling of just being overwhelmed by the system and thinking that there's a middle ground for how to address this. And, the NCAA, to its credit, is trying, and they're implementing more rules and guardrails, and you look at the transfer windows. But I think there's still a feeling that these things need to be tweaked before a more optimal model is reached. But at the same time, if there is such a thing as revenue sharing or employee status or all of these other potential changes to the model, then, those will have effects on transfers as well, and NAL as well. And none of these things happen in isolation. And I think the hard thing is an optimal model for one only works with the rest of the context as is, and the context is constantly changing. So it makes it really hard to figure out a way to, sustainably win and build a dynasty.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It is overwhelming, and it's the timing is really weird too. I think everybody, when you mentioned that, we're like, yeah, I'm going to ask Ayden a question, then I'm going to go to Jason next after that, because I feel like Jason will have some juicy facts and numbers around it all. Ayden, with the transfer portal, have you noticed any change in how brands are interacting with those particular transfer athletes, or do you see is it still a pretty consistent flow of how it used to be?
It's generally consistent, but that's also a factor of how we engage with brands. So generally speaking, we're not doing multi-year, large-scale brand ambassador campaigns for an individual athlete. So if an athlete isn't at a school 6 months after he began a campaign, generally speaking, that campaign is concluded. So ultimately, we're not observing too much significant changes between the way that brands engage with athletes. If anyway, kind of the massive volume of movement amongst athletes across the country is actually beneficial for the marketplace, because brands who have already engaged with athletes are now getting to reach new markets and new followers, and athletes inherently are actually building their followings as they go to new schools and are now engaging with new audiences and new markets. But generally speaking, like, our campaigns are not, over a year, or generally even over 6 months with an individual athlete. Our campaigns are tens of thousands of athletes at one time. That's really the value add that we're providing here, and that's why we're able to deliver deals to all athletes throughout the country at the time. Where we do see significant, kind of work and adjustments that we need to make internally is within the data in the marketplace. So athletes are frequently prompted to update their information. We work very closely with institutions and their compliance reps to make sure that we have the most updated rosters, to ensure that where athletes aren't updating their information, we're doing it for them. And then with the handful of collectives that use our software to distribute deals and manage communications and payments with athletes, we see a big influx in transfer portal windows, both with regards to payments distributed through the platform, but also with support needed to get new athletes set up.
Yeah. And you mentioned the brands are now able to access a totally different market when an athlete moves from one university to another. Have you noticed or have any information around, do they lose the former base of fans when they leave Penn State to go to Alabama? Do they lose the Penn State base, or do those fans still like to follow them? Curious about that.
Yeah. I don't have the specific data with regards to, follower decreases following a transfer, right? Whether you lose 25% of your Penn State followers. But I would assume that generally speaking, the majority of those followers are still following that athlete. So as a result, you're really getting to double dip almost into two markets, which goes towards building, a more national notoriety on an individual basis for the athletes when they transfer. It really, in a way, it helps with their overall audience and reach, which ultimately directly correlates to the amount of earnings they can make on MOGL, the overall ROI they can deliver to brands on a cost per impression basis. And it really helps the overall marketplace velocity and reach.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. I'm going to go to Jason, and then I'm going to ask Darien about that, because I remember you talking on the panel in Detroit. I want to ask you around transfer portal stuff. Jason, what do you think about it all? Do you have numbers for us again? We like your facts.
It's a mess.
Okay. Very factual.
Yeah. Understated. Cluster is probably the right thing to say. And this is coming from somebody that has long advocated for student athlete autonomy and rights, but completely unregulated free agency has created nothing short of a disaster. So just giving you numbers right now, the top 50 basketball players in this year's transfer portal, the average is around $685,000 in compensation for top 50. The top player, Kadari Richmond, just transferred from inner conference from Seton Hall to St. John's, and he was paid $1 million from St. John's, or will get $1 million from St. John's for that. I know that as a fact because I worked on a contract for him for one of our other schools who is paying less, but because of the taxes in that state, he would have made more than if he was going to Queens, New York. So we worked very closely with that. The biggest problem in that space right now is that you have agents who are not really agents, but mothers, cousins, brothers, roommates, who knows, that are telling kids to go into the portal. We did an analysis. We have more than 600 basketball players that are signed with us. We did an analysis of all of their agents. Less than 20% were actually registered under the Uniform Athlete Agent Act in the state in which the athlete that they were representing is a student athlete, right? So you have literally hundreds of people committing felonies, representing these athletes, telling them to go into the portal. We have scenarios in which athlete says, if you don't pay me X by this time, I'm leaving. And it happens. And it's like the most immature, stupid decision you can ever imagine. And guess what happens to most of these kids? They end up getting nothing. And it's because somebody is telling them something that they have no concept. And the other part of it is that it's exhausting for coaches, beyond exhausting. Everybody says they're not tampering, but they're all tampering because they have no choice, and we can't blame them. They have to recruit their athletes. They have to go and get new athletes. And so and the administration is like, their hands are tied, because it's like, what are they supposed to do? I don't think these are not students, and they're athletes. I don't know if they're students. And think about the implication from this perspective. You're going to have athletes that have gone to 5 or 6 different schools by the time they graduate. Do they have an alma mater?
Oh, that's what Darien was going to, I was going to ask you about that, because he said the same thing. It's like, where do you call home then?
You don't. Darren, go ahead.
No, you're spot on, Jason, and I'm glad to hear you echo these sentiments. And as Tina said, I spoke at this a couple of sessions in Detroit throughout the draft weekend about this. My main thing is about community. College is still about building community, and I'm as competitive as it gets when it comes to winning. Former student athlete, we all want to win in all facets of life and what we're doing. But as you mentioned, if you're on school 3 or 4, where do you go for homecoming? Where do you take your family in 10, 15 years to come back for a reunion? Like you said, you don't really have an alma mater. And so it really is figuring out, how do you retain your athletes? How do you still develop from the high school level? And then how do you fill in the gaps, like Laine was saying, from a roster management standpoint to create a culture and a program that can compete for titles? It obviously is incredibly more challenging in this landscape of collegiate athletics. But I would be hard pressed to say that the schools that you are seeing winning titles are the ones that are following the model of creating that culture of community, to where, yes, you have to have NIL in this day and age. You have to have that type of mechanism. At the same time, you still can build community within your program, and you can still have a culture of like, this is a place you should be proud of when you are attending school. Same, again, just as you mentioned, Jason, I'm all about athlete empowerment. Again, as a former student athlete, didn't have NIL, didn't have the transfer portal. But at the same time, and especially if you're asking donors, now fans, to be incentivized to be a part of the NIL journey with these student athletes, how are they able to latch on to the student athletes when you don't know if they're which is why in women's basketball, they're having a lot of success in terms of building their sport, because those athletes are at the school for 3 and 4 years. Now, of course, there are transfer situations there that we are seeing come up across the country. But if you think about, again, some of the premier programs in women's college basketball, their athletes are there for 3-4 years. As a fan base and as an alumni base, you can grow with those athletes. You know them, you know they're going to be there, and then you trust them to be there, and then you build a community that way.
Yeah, love it. I'm glad that you said that, Jason, because that's exactly what I was thinking about, bringing Darien into this. And we are at 9 minutes left. And because we have very brilliant people on the panel, I want to make sure that we have time for questions from the group. So we won't get to the fourth topic today. So I am going to open up the question chat. Actually, Jen is texting me the questions out of here. So I'm looking at my phone only for notes purposes. I'm not tweeting anything right now. One question from the audience is, and this is open to anybody, what advice do you have for smaller Division I institutions trying to compete in the NIL space? Anybody can chime in.
Ayden, do you want to take this one first, maybe?
Yeah, so I was just going to say, if they have interest in structuring a collective, obviously that's a worthwhile way in order to support a smaller subset of your broader student athletes. So, and they're generally fairly easy to set up. But broadly, to support your entire student athlete basis, I think the things that schools need to really be focusing on, regardless of size, but specifically at the smaller sizes, D2, D3, you need to focus on like, how can we really access our community? So fans, local businesses, corporate sponsors where appropriate as well. How can we really get them around the table in order to support our student athletes? There's a variety of ways to do it, right? Obviously, you know, we have software that enables schools to do it, but if you don't want to take that route, that's perfectly fine. But you really need to be thinking about, all right, how can we really get our community and what really differentiates Marshall University around our athletes, right?
So maximizing the community, the people you already have in your community. Yeah, love it. Anybody else have one comment on that, and then we'll move to the next question?
Well, one thing I want to say just more broadly is the model of college athletics is changing. We know that. And in 2 years, it's going to look very different than it looks like right now. And what the model will look like, and nobody has a crystal ball, but what I believe is that it's going to look a lot more like baseball than it does football. And what that means is that it's not going to be that everyone is going to have this salary cap and everyone at the SEC is going to get paid X and then somebody's going to pay Y. There's going to be minimums that leagues are going to decide that, hey, this is what we can provide our athletes. And then it's going to be like baseball, where if you have a big owner or donors or a great collective, you're going to be able to do that. And so as it relates to, I had a conversation with the commissioner of a mid-major conference last week. They got absolutely decimated in the transfer portal around basketball. And he literally said, the future of our league seems to be a farm system for the majors. And I said, you're right. And I said, that's exactly what's going to happen unless you get all of your schools together and you say, we're going to have a strategy that we're going to embark on together. And that includes putting student athletes that come to our universities on multi-year agreements so that if they do decide to transfer, the money that they're going to get or the mitigation that's going to come in through liquidated damages is going to allow you to recoup some of those costs. right?
Mm-hmm.
So just like you play in a guarantee game now, and just like there's a transfer fee, if you go have an athlete and you're in the Premier League and you have an athlete that you bring up through your system and then
Mm-hmm.
Barcelona wants to take them from you, great. You're going to pay us for all the money that we invested into that athlete. That is the future of college athletics. And so if you're a mid-major athletics department, you need to be thinking about how you protect your assets, and your assets are your student athletes.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And what you're saying is not unreasonable. It's very reflective of even the corporate job market. If a company relocates you and pays you 20 grand to move from New York to LA, and then you end up quitting in 6 months, you have to pay that money back, and that's not unfair. And so I love it. Okay, next question is. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Cody. You
I
going?
was just going to say, I think Jason's is absolutely correct, which is this is all going to be done through contracting, and right now that's at the collective level. And I know I saw a couple questions come in related to the academic piece and whether the transfer portal and all of this, that academic requirements for student athletes are just going to go away. I have both drafted and reviewed collective agreements that have requirements in them that student athletes are in good standing, in academic good standing with an institution. It doesn't necessarily need to be the institution that athlete is at, but to receive their payments ongoing, they must maintain academic good standing. And so it's the same thing. You can sign multi-year contracts. You can have requirements that they be full-time enrolled or online enrolled, or whatever the restrictions you want to be. And right now that's being done at the collective level. In a year or two, that will likely be done at the institutional level. And do the institutions want to require them to be full-time students in good standing? I think the answer is yes. But if you're going to recognize these athletes and you put them to reasonable contracts that can include those types of things, that both protect the academic integrity of this process, but also, as Jason talked about, the mid-majors protecting themselves with various contracts that allow them to recover in the event that athletes step up. But that's what we are seeing now.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I hadn't even thought about that element of it too, but that's always existed, some kind of academic minimum to be eligible to participate in your sport. Thank you. All right, I'm going to do the next question. With donor fatigue growing and higher costs everywhere, how do you all as a panel see the impacting attendance and venue experience? And Darien, you kind of talked about it a little bit too, but donor fatigue, things are more expensive. Are we going to see a change in the experience and attendance at physical games?
Yeah, I don't think in terms of folks not going to games. I think everybody at the end of the day, as much as there's a lot of discourse online, social media, Twitter, things like that, people still love to go to live sporting events, and people want to support their school and support their team. What I do think we'll see is, especially from a technological standpoint, a lot of calls to action about how do you, with revenue generating purposes. So you think of QR coding a link directly to the collective on a video board. You think of different ways to raise money for collective efforts, for revenue generating efforts. And then, as Jason mentioned, a lot of these collectives, you're going to have to find ways to generate money outside of just asking the donor base or the fan base. You have to get into corporate space. You have to find ways to generate revenue outside of, again, just asking people to donate and give money. That's still going to be a big part of it also. And then the next phase is, how can universities leverage the experiences that they have, that they can provide in exchange for dollars going into a collective. And I know, Tina, what you all have with Five Star Fans is another example, right, of a revenue sharing model between the fan base and the collective. So everybody collectively, no pun intended, has to kind of put their heads together and figure out, how do we raise money? How do we get money going into the pockets of student athletes for the right reasons, outside of just going to the same donors over and over again, that you're also asking for money for scholarship endowments, facilities, and other aspects of raising money for a department.
Thank you. Thanks, Darien. And thank you, everyone. I think Tina's Wi-Fi might have cut out here in the very last minute. We're down to 1 minute, maybe even 30 seconds. So I'm Jennifer, co-founder of Five Star Fans as well. And I just can't thank the 5 of you enough for being on this panel with us. And thank you to NACDA for the opportunity to share. I know we've gotten some really great feedback, and we've already been asked to make sure that we can share this out to everyone who registered today. So those of you at NACDA, we'll look forward to seeing you. And again, Cody, Ayden, Jason, Laine, and Darien, thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to staying in touch with each of you. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.